August 1945. The forests near Hagen. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the column of 50 German women prisoners. They marched in a ragged line, their boots kicking up clouds of dry, choking dust. Their stomachs were empty, twisted into knots by days of meager rations. Hunger was the only thing on their minds. They whispered about the lunch break. Would it be soup? Would there be bread? The forest around them was silent. No birds sang here. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the women and the crunch of dry leaves. They were walking deeper into a zone where life had abandoned the earth. Then the smell hit them. It didn't come gradually. It was a wall. One moment the air smelled of pine resin and dust. The next, it was thick with a cloying sweet sickness. It tasted of copper, old meat, and wet earth. The women in the front ranks stumbled, covering their noses with their sleeves. Gagging sounds rippled down the line. It was a primal scent, one that triggered an ancient alarm in the human brain. This was not the smell of war, it was the smell of extinction, and yet their starving stomachs rumbled, confusing the biological urge to eat with the biological urge to flee. They entered the clearing. The trees broke away to reveal a scar on the landscape. A long, jagged trench had been torn into the forest floor. The earth here was dark, oily, and disturbed. Above the trench, the air shimmered, not just from heat, but from the movement of millions of flies. The sound was deafening, a low-frequency hum like an electric generator. The women froze. They saw shapes protruding from the gray clay. A human boot, a pale hand, the fabric of a striped uniform. The denial they had clung to for years shattered in an instant. This was a mass grave. The commander stepped forward. He was an American lieutenant, his face hard as stone. He didn't yell. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying anger. "You claimed you didn't know," he said, looking at the group of secretaries, nurses, and civilians. "You lived 5 miles from here. You smelled this every time the wind changed. Today you will not look away." He kicked a pile of shovels towards them. The metal clatter startled the women. "Pick them up. You are not going back to the camp until you uncover what you tried to hide." The first shovel struck the earth. It was a young woman named Helga who moved first, driven by fear of the guards. She thrust the blade into the soft, yielding soil. The smell released by the disturbed earth was so potent it made her knees buckle. She retched, dry heaving. Nothing but bile coming up. The other women watched in horror, clutching their stomachs. They were starving, dizzy with hunger, yet surrounded by the ultimate loss of appetite. They picked up their tools, tears streaming down their faces, and began the nightmare work. For 3 hours, they dug in the sweltering heat. The work was slow and horrific. With every shovel of earth removed, the reality became undeniable. They weren't just moving dirt. They were uncovering neighbors, shopkeepers, children. Helga uncovered a pair of broken glasses, the lenses cracked, but still resting on a skull. She recognized the frames. They looked like the ones the local schoolteacher wore. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image, but the smell was inescapable. It clung to their hair, their skin, their clothes. Then, a whistle blew sharply. "Stop," the sergeant shouted. "Lunch break." The words sounded absurd in this place. A truck backed into the clearing, its gears grinding. It wasn't a transport truck. It was a mobile field kitchen. Steam rose from 2 large metal vats. The smell of boiled cabbage and potato soup wafted across the clearing, colliding violently with the stench of the grave. It was a nauseating mixture, life and death, food and rot, swirling together in the hot air. The women moved towards the trees, away from the pit. Their instinct was to get as far away from the bodies as possible to eat. They wanted to find a patch of clean grass, somewhere the wind blew fresh. But the guards blocked their path. No, the sergeant said, stepping in front of them. He pointed a gloved finger directly at the edge of the open trench, inches from the exposed remains. You will eat there, but the smell, a woman pleaded. We cannot eat there. Please. The sergeant's face didn't soften. They didn't get to choose where they died, he replied coldly. You don't get to choose where you eat. Line up. Get your bowls. Sit on the mound. The order was absolute. It was psychological warfare. He was forcing them to nourish their own bodies while staring at the bodies they had starved. Trembling, they lined up for the soup. The cook ladled thick, grayish potato soup into their metal mess tins. Under any other circumstances, this hot meal would have been a blessing. They were starving. Their ribs showed through their shirts, but as Helga took her bowl, her hands shaking, she looked at the soup. A black fly landed on the surface. Then another. The flies from the grave were now interested in the food. They sat on the edge of the abyss. 50 women sat in a row along the lip of the mass grave, legs dangling inches above the dead. The heat beat down. The smell rose up in invisible waves, wrapping around the hot soup. Helga lifted the spoon to her mouth. Her stomach roared with hunger, begging for the calories. But her throat closed tight in a spasm of revulsion. She looked at the skull with the glasses. She looked at the spoon. To eat was to accept life amidst death. To not eat was to die. A spoon clattered against a metal bowl. The silence was broken. A young prisoner, scarcely 18, couldn't hold it back. She leaned forward, convulsing, and vomited into the open trench. The sound was wet and violent. It triggered a chain reaction. 2 other women dropped their bowls, burying their faces in their hands, gagging uncontrollably. The smell of the grave mixed with the sour smell of sickness, creating an atmosphere so toxic it felt suffocating. Eat it, the sergeant roared. He didn't step back. He stepped closer. You waste nothing. You threw people away like trash, but you will not throw this food away. Pick up your bowls. The cruelty was precise. He wasn't just feeding them. He was forcing them to digest their guilt. He wanted the food to taste like the grave. He wanted the memory of this meal to haunt them forever. Helga looked at the gray liquid. Her hand trembled so hard, the spoon rattled against her teeth. She forced herself to breathe through her mouth, to avoid the smell. But the air itself tasted of rot. She took a spoonful. It was lukewarm and bland. But as she swallowed, a fly buzzed past her nose. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out, mixing with the sweat and dirt on her face. Swallow, she told herself. Swallow or die. They ate like machines. One by one, the survival instinct took over. The biological need for calories overrode the psychological horror. They shoveled the soup into their mouths quickly, trying not to taste it, trying not to look at the bones protruding from the clay just feet away. It was a grotesque picnic. 50 women sitting on a mound of death, consuming life, while the guards watched with arms crossed, satisfied with the lesson. A piece of potato felt like a stone in Helga's throat. She gagged, covering her mouth with her hand. She stared at the glasses on the skull in the trench. For a split second, she imagined the skull watching her eat, watching her nourish herself, while he rotted. The shame was hotter than the sun. She finished the bowl, scraping the bottom, not because she wanted to, but because she knew she needed the strength to cover him back up. Finished. Good, the sergeant said. Back to work. The break was over. The soup sat heavy and churning in their stomachs. As they stood up, dizzy and nauseous, they picked up the shovels again. The energy from the food didn't make them stronger. It made them feel complicit. They had eaten death, and now they had to bury it. The digging resumed, heavier than before. The soup sat like lead in their stomachs. Every time they bent down, bile rose in their throats. But the rhythm of the shovels changed. It wasn't frantic anymore. It was terrified. They were afraid of what they would find next. Helga was clearing soil near the edge of the trench when her shovel hit something soft. It wasn't bone. It wasn't wood. She knelt down, scraping the dirt away with her gloved fingers. She pulled it out of the gray clay. It was small and heavy with mud. Helga wiped it on her sleeve. Colors began to emerge from the gray. A faded red dress, a porcelain face with one eye missing, a tuft of synthetic blonde hair. It was a doll, a child's doll. It was clutching a tiny knitted blanket. Helga stopped breathing. The skull with the glasses had been terrifying. But this was shattering. Mein Gott, a woman whispered behind her. Magda, an older prisoner with 3 children back in Berlin, dropped her shovel. The sound of metal hitting stone echoed like a gunshot. She stared at the doll in Helga's hand. The abstraction of enemies or casualties evaporated. This wasn't a soldier. This wasn't a political opponent. This was a little girl who had brought her favorite toy to the edge of a pit and never left. Magda collapsed to her knees. A wail tore out of her throat, a raw animal sound of pure grief. It wasn't just for the child in the grave. It was for the loss of her own humanity, for the blindness of her nation. What have we done? She screamed, rocking back and forth in the dirt. What have we done? The cry triggered a collapse. One by one, the women stopped digging. They didn't rebel. They simply broke. The guards stepped forward, unsure. Usually they would shout. Usually they would threaten. But even the American sergeant hesitated. He looked at the doll, then at the weeping women. He saw the shift. They weren't arrogant Nazis anymore. They were broken mothers staring into the abyss of their own history. He lowered his rifle slightly. "Keep working," he said, but his voice lacked its usual thunder. It was quiet, almost respectful of the horror. Helga placed the doll gently on the bank. She didn't throw it in the pile with the shoes. She set it upright on a clean patch of grass, brushing the dirt from its dress. It sat there like a silent judge, watching them. Helga picked up her shovel again. Her hands weren't trembling anymore. They were heavy with a terrible purpose. She wasn't digging for the Americans now. She was digging to apologize. The sun began to dip below the tree line. Long shadows stretched across the clearing, turning the open grave into a pool of darkness. The women were exhausted, covered in sweat, dirt, and the stench of death. They had cleared the earth from dozens of bodies, preparing them for the identification teams arriving tomorrow. The sergeant checked his watch. "All right, tools down," he shouted. "Back to the trucks. Move out." But nobody moved. Usually, the order to leave was the best moment of the day. But today, 50 women stood rooted to the spot. They looked at the exposed remains lying in the dirt, the neighbors they had ignored, the children they hadn't saved. To leave them alone in the dark forest felt like a second betrayal. Magda, the woman who had collapsed earlier, wiped her dirty hands on her skirt and stepped closer to the trench. "What are you doing?" the sergeant snapped. "I said move." Magda didn't look at him. She looked at the doll sitting on the grass bank. She slowly clasped her hands together. It wasn't a Nazi salute. It was a prayer. She began to hum a low, mournful tune. A lullaby. Guten Abend. Gut Nacht. Good evening. Good night. One by one, the other women joined in. It wasn't loud. It was a hum that vibrated through the silent forest. The sergeant raised his baton, then stopped. He saw the tears streaming down their faces. He saw the complete lack of defiance in their eyes. There was only sorrow. These weren't soldiers refusing an order. These were human beings trying to claw back a shred of their souls. He lowered his arm. He took off his helmet and held it against his chest. For a full minute, the only sound in the German forest was the humming of 50 prisoners mourning their victims. "Amen," Magda whispered. The humming faded. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It wasn't the terrified silence of the morning. It was the silence of acknowledgement. "Magda, bent down and picked up a single wildflower growing near the trench. She placed it next to the doll. "We cannot bury you," she whispered to the bones. "But we see you now. Let's go," the sergeant said quietly. This time, they obeyed. They turned away from the grave, walking slowly back towards the trucks. They didn't march. They walked like mourners leaving a funeral. They were tired, hungry, and covered in filth. But the heavy burden of denial had been lifted. They climbed into the trucks, leaving the dead in the care of the forest, but taking the memory with them forever. The ride back to the camp was silent. The engine roared, but inside the canvas-covered truck, 50 women sat shoulder to shoulder without speaking. They were coated in the dust of the grave. They looked at their hands, hands that had touched the bones of their neighbors. The hunger that had defined their captivity was gone, replaced by a hollow ache in their souls. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were witnesses, and witnesses carry a burden that never gets lighter. Back at the camp, dinner was served. It was the same watery soup, the same stale bread. Usually there would be shoving, hiding food, trading scraps. Tonight the mess hall was like a cathedral. Helga sat down. She didn't look at the food with greed. She looked at it with terrifying respect. She remembered the flies on her lunch. She remembered the open mouths of the skulls that would never eat again. She lifted her spoon. They ate every single crumb. Helga scraped her metal bowl until it shone. She wiped the bread crust around the rim, catching every drop. It wasn't because she was starving, though she was. It was an act of penance. To waste food was to mock the dead they had just left in the forest. From that day on, waste became a sin worse than theft. They ate to prove they were alive, and they ate to apologize for surviving. Decades later, a kitchen in Berlin, Helga was an old woman now. Her grandson, Thomas, pushed his plate away, half-eaten. "I'm full, Oma," he complained. "I don't like the potatoes." Helga didn't get angry. She didn't shout. She just looked at the plate with a strange, distant sadness. Her mind flashed back to the heat, the flies, and the smell of the trench. "We do not leave food, Thomas," she said softly. She pulled his plate towards her. She picked up the fork and ate the cold potatoes herself, slowly, methodically. "Why do you always do that?" Thomas asked. Helga wiped her mouth. "Because I once had lunch with people who couldn't eat," she replied, "and every bite I leave behind feels like I am forgetting them again." The grave was closed, but the lesson remained open. For the women who stood on the edge of the abyss, food never tasted the same again. It tasted of gratitude, and it tasted of grief. If you believe that history lives on in our daily habits, please subscribe. Share this video to remember that a full plate is a privilege, not a right. Thank you for watching.